Have you ever wondered what happens when the universe witnesses a heartbeat defy its own laws? When something that should have stopped starts again, not from reason, but from will. On Virel 9, death was absolute. No species had ever returned once entropy claimed its due. But then, the human's heart, silent for 6 hours, began to beat. On its own, without permission. The alien medics fainted. The machines failed. And for the first time in 80,000 years of order, chaos had a pulse. Captain Ezra Cole was dead, and still refused to rest. He wasn't fighting for survival. He wasn't obeying logic. He was simply doing what humanity has always done, choosing to exist, even when existence makes no sense. Because maybe that's our secret. We don't live because we can. We live because we refuse not to. Before we begin, subscribe, like, and tell me from which city or planet you're watching this. This story explores one of humanity's greatest paradoxes: why meaning matters more than survival. Captain Ezra Cole had 47 seconds to prove that humanity deserved to exist, and he did something no rational species would ever do. He smiled. The translucent corridors of Virel 9 medical station pulsed like veins of blue light, carrying bioenergia through walls that seemed more alive than built. Dr. Serka of the Thyran watched the human body through the observation dome, her 6 crystalline eyes fixed on the impossible sight before her. The human had been dead for 6 hours, his heart silent, his brain dark. Every cellular function ceased according to 17 independent scans. And then, without warning, without external stimulus, without permission from the universe itself, the human heart began to beat. The monitoring screens erupted in cascades of red alerts. Serka's assistant, a young Thyran named Velkor, collapsed as the sensors registered something that violated the fundamental law of controlled entropy. The sound echoed through the medical chamber, a wet, organic thump that made every Thyran in the room recoil in horror. It was the sound of chaos choosing to continue. Serka steadied herself against the console, her breathing apparatus struggling to filter the sudden spike of stress pheromones flooding the room. In 80,000 years of Thyran medical history, in 40,000 years of Confederation record-keeping across 10,000 species, no dead organism had ever restarted spontaneously. Death was order. Life was controlled transition. This was biological heresy. The Galactic Medical Codex was explicit. Reanimation required external energy input, calibrated to precisely 0.001% variance. Any deviation meant failure. Any success outside parameters meant impossibility. Yet the telemetry from the human's chest cavity showed something that defied every principle Serka had dedicated 3 centuries to perfecting. The human heart had restarted itself. From nothing. From death. From pure, stubborn refusal to accept what every logical system in the universe said was final. Serka forced her primary eyes to focus on the biological readouts. Captain Ezra Cole, United States Space Force, age 32 Terran years. Deceased 6 hours prior from catastrophic radiation exposure during the rescue of a Confederation survey vessel. His crew manifest listed 1 casualty beyond himself. Lieutenant Maya Santos, co-pilot, killed in the same incident that should have been Cole's end. The Thyran physician had reviewed the incident log 17 times, searching for meaning in the chaos. Cole had violated direct protocol. When the radiation breach occurred, standard procedure was immediate retreat. Preserve the living, accept calculated loss. But Cole had done something incomprehensibly human. He had stayed. He had manually sealed the breach, exposing himself to lethal radiation, buying time for the alien crew to evacuate. And his co-pilot, Maya Santos, had died trying to drag him back to safety. The psychological profile Earth had transmitted was sparse but devastating. Lieutenant Santos had 3 children. Captain Cole had promised her family he would bring her home. He hadn't. Now Serka watched as the impossible human's eyelids began to flutter, responding to signals from a brain that, by every measure, should have been beyond recovery. The bioenergia field they'd applied was meant to simply preserve the tissues for study. It was supposed to be a test of Thyron regenerative techniques, a controlled experiment to see if human cellular structure could even interface with the harmonic frequencies of Virel 9. Instead, something had gone catastrophically wrong. Or impossibly right, depending on one's perspective on chaos. The gravitational sensors mounted on the chamber walls registered their first anomaly. 0.003% distortion in Virel 9's normally perfect field harmonics. The epicenter was precise, the human's cardiac tissue. Serka's tertiary eyes dilated in what her species experienced as profound unease. She had spent her entire career eliminating entropy, perfecting the art of biological order. And now she was watching entropy gain consciousness. The human's chest rose, fell, rose again. Each breath seemed to pull something from the very fabric of the station, as if Captain Cole's lungs weren't just processing oxygen, but drawing on the fundamental energy that kept Virel 9 alive. The bioenergia field flickered, disrupted by rhythms it wasn't designed to accommodate. Human biology, Serka realized with creeping horror, didn't synchronize with universal harmonics. It imposed its own. Records from the Confederation census indicated that Earth was classified as a Class 12 hazard world, gravity 3.2 times above safe parameters, atmospheric composition toxic to 73% of known species, predator density that should have prevented complex sentience from evolving. Yet humans had not merely survived that brutal crucible. They had thrived. They had built cities, created art, developed philosophy while dodging carnivores that outweighed them 10 to 1. Serka had read those reports with clinical detachment. Now, watching the human's heart beat with increasing strength against every principle of ordered biology, she understood what the data had failed to convey. Humans didn't evolve in harmony with their environment. They evolved in spite of it. And that defiance, that stubborn insistence on existing where existence should be impossible, was written into every cell of their bodies. Captain Cole's eyes opened. They were brown, a color Serka's species didn't possess, warm and dark like the soil of a death world. His gaze swept the chamber, unfocused, seeking. His lips moved, forming words too quiet for the audio sensors to capture. But Serka, who had studied human linguistic patterns in preparation for this procedure, could read them clearly enough. Maya. He was calling for his dead co-pilot. For the woman whose children would grow up without a mother, because Ezra Cole had chosen strangers over safety. And in that moment, as the human's vital signs stabilized at levels that should have been impossible, as his heart settled into a rhythm that pulled against the very pulse of Virel 9 itself, Dr. Serka understood something that terrified her more than any chaos ever could. This human didn't want to be alive. But his body, that magnificent, terrible engine of biological defiance, had chosen survival anyway. And if Ezra Cole's consciousness couldn't stop his own heart, what force in the ordered universe possibly could? 6 months before his death, Ezra Cole had stood in the observation deck of the orbital station above Earth, watching the planet rotate beneath him in blues and greens and browns, and felt absolutely nothing. Maya Santos had found him there at 0300 hours, off-duty, staring at their home with eyes that couldn't remember why it mattered. She hadn't asked him what was wrong. Maya never did. She'd simply stood beside him close enough that their shoulders touched through their flight suits and said, "My daughter asked me why space is black. I told her it's because all the colors went to Earth instead." Ezra had looked at her then, really looked, and seen what he'd been trying to forget. That Maya had reasons to return. 3 small faces that lit up when she walked through the door. A purpose beyond protocol. Something to lose. Now, 47 light years from that moment, Ezra Cole opened his eyes to a ceiling that breathed with bioluminescent veins and tried to understand why he was still capable of opening them at all. Pain came first. Not the sharp agony of injury, but something deeper, more fundamental, as if his cells themselves were arguing with reality about whether they had permission to exist. His chest felt too tight, too hot, each heartbeat echoing through his bones like a drum he couldn't silence. When he tried to draw breath, the air tasted wrong, thick with something that made his lungs struggle for purchase. A face appeared above him. 6 crystalline eyes, arranged in a pattern that hurt to process with human binocular vision, set in a face of overlapping translucent plates that shifted colors with what Ezra's combat-trained mind recognized as emotional broadcasting. Right now, those plates flickered between pale gray and sickly yellow, a color combination that needed no translation. Fear. The alien was afraid of him. Captain Cole. The voice came from a translator somewhere beyond his field of vision, rendering alien speech into flat, emotionless English. You are experiencing consciousness. This is unexpected. Please remain still while we assess the biological damage. Biological damage. As if he were a structure that had suffered weather problems rather than a man who had died. Ezra tried to speak, but his throat closed around the words, producing only a wet, rattling sound that made the alien physician flinch backward. Dr. Serka, her identification badge proclaimed, though the symbols were overlaid with human-readable text that wavered at the edges. Chief of Medical Operations, Varel 9 Station. Specialization: Entropic Disorder Prevention. Entropic disorder. Ezra would have laughed if his lungs could remember how. His entire life had been entropic disorder. Growing up in Baltimore after the water wars, watching his mother work 3 jobs to keep their apartment above the floodline. Joining the Space Force because Earth felt too small for all the chaos he carried. Meeting Maya, who somehow looked at his mess of a life and saw something worth saving, and then failing her. Spectacularly. Finally. Completely. The memory surfaced like a body from deep water, unstoppable and devastating. The Confederation survey ship, crippled and venting atmosphere. The radiation alert screaming through his helmet. Maya's voice on the comm. Ezra, negative, we abort, that's a direct order. And his hands, his stupid, heroic hands, overriding the retreat sequence and flying into hell anyway, because there were 17 aliens on that ship. 17 beings whose lives the mathematical part of his brain had weighed against protocol and found protocol lacking. Maya had followed him in. Of course she had. Maya always followed when someone she cared about did something stupidly noble. The radiation had taken them both, but apparently only one of them had stayed dead. Serka's crystalline eyes were fixed on something beyond Ezra's line of sight, some readout that was making her facial plates pulse that sickly yellow-gray faster and faster. Her voice, when it came through the translator, carried an edge that needed no emotional context to interpret. Your cardiac rhythms are destabilizing the bioenergia field. The harmonic frequency of your heart muscle is creating interference patterns across 14% of the station. This should not be physiologically possible. Medical records from the Thyron Collective, transmitted to Earth as part of the initial diplomatic exchange, had been explicit about their species' relationship with biological order. Thyron had evolved on a world where the slightest genetic variation triggered immune cascades that could sterilize continents. Their entire civilization was built on the principle of perfect homeostasis. No chaos, no variation, no entropy that couldn't be predicted and controlled. And here was Ezra Cole, a walking violation of every principle they held sacred. His heart beating to a rhythm that belonged to no ordered system the Confederation had ever encountered. How long? Ezra managed to force the words out, each syllable tasting of copper and regret. How long have you been conscious? Serka's translation device adjusted for his weakness, amplifying his voice. 47 seconds. No. Ezra's hand moved to his chest, feeling the too strong thump beneath his sternum, the way it seemed to pull at something deeper than tissue. How long was I dead? The alien physician's emotional broadcasts shifted to a color Ezra had no reference for, something between deep purple and the absence of light. When she spoke, even the translator seemed to struggle with conveying what her species felt about what came next. 6 hours, 14 minutes, and 32 seconds. Your cellular degradation was measured at 47% neural viability loss. By every standard the Confederation has established over 40 millennia of medical practice, Captain Cole, you are still dead. Your body simply hasn't accepted that fact yet. Ezra closed his eyes. Behind the lids, he saw Maya's face. Not peaceful, not forgiving. Screaming his name as radiation cooked through their shields, her hands reaching for him even as her own body began to fail. Her last act one of futile rescue for a man who had already chosen his death. Her children. 3 faces Ezra had memorized from the family photos Maya kept in her locker. 8, 6, and 4 years old. Old enough to remember their mother, young enough to need her desperately. And Ezra had taken her from them because he couldn't bear the weight of 17 alien strangers dying on his watch. The monitoring equipment began to alarm, a rising wail that made Serka's facial plates flash white with what Ezra recognized as panic. His heart rate was climbing, not in the smooth acceleration of exertion but in chaotic spikes that corresponded to nothing his body should be doing. And with each spike, something else happened. The metal examination table beneath him began to warp. Not melt, not break, but bend, as if gravity had suddenly decided to press harder in a radius centered on his chest. Serka stumbled backward as the gravitational field of the room itself seemed to twist, pulling equipment toward Ezra like iron to a lodestone. "Stop!" The alien physician's voice cut through even without translation, pure urgency transcending species. "Whatever you're feeling, you must suppress it. Your emotional state is creating gravitational distortions." But Ezra couldn't stop, because he understood now what he hadn't in those final seconds before the radiation took him. Maya hadn't followed him into that death because she believed in his heroic gesture. She'd followed because she knew he would try to save everyone, even at the cost of himself, and someone had to be there to save him from his own stupid, beautiful need to matter. And he had killed her for it. Killed a mother of 3 because he thought 17 strangers outweighed one person who actually loved him. The gravitational distortion intensified. Serka activated an emergency protocol, flooding the chamber with a suppression field that pressed against Ezra's chest like a physical weight. The pressure was immediate and agonizing, forcing his heart rate down through sheer external control, stabilizing the gravitational anomaly through brute force. As his consciousness began to gray at the edges, Ezra heard Serka's voice, distant and fading, speaking to someone beyond the chamber. "Prepare containment level Omega. And contact the Confederation Council. Tell them we have a problem. Tell them the human refuses to die properly. And tell them I don't know if that makes him the most dangerous thing I've ever treated, or the most tragic." In the darkness that followed, Ezra dreamed of Maya's hands reaching for him across the void and wondered which answer he wanted it to be. For 6 months, Dr. Serka watched the impossible human die slowly from the inside, while his heart refused to stop beating. The gravitational suppressor mounted on Ezra Cole's chest was a marvel of Thyran engineering, a device that forced his cardiac rhythms into harmonious compliance with Varel 9's bioenergia field. It worked perfectly. It kept the station stable. It prevented the entropic cascades that threatened to destabilize the life support systems for 47,000 beings. It was also killing him by inches. Serka had documented every stage. The cardiac tissue scarring that accumulated each time the suppressor forced his heart to beat against its natural chaos. The neural degradation from 18 hours daily of fighting his own biology. The psychological fractures that appeared in his behavioral patterns as the device slowly crushed the autonomy that made him functionally human. And yet, Captain Ezra Cole apologized to her every morning. When his body convulsed during suppressor recalibration, when the pain made him bite through his lip to keep from screaming, when the hallucinations induced by constant neural suppression made him weep for people who weren't there, his first coherent words afterward were always the same. "I'm sorry for the trouble." It was incomprehensible. Serka had treated thousands of patients across 3 centuries. Pain made beings angry. Suffering made them bitter. Prolonged medical intervention made them resentful of their caregivers. That was universal, logical, predictable. But Ezra Cole, dying gradually from a treatment that existed only to contain the chaos his species called normal, felt guilty for inconveniencing others. Serka's observation logs, transmitted weekly to the Confederation Council, had become less clinical and more questioning with each entry. She found herself writing sentences that would have been unthinkable 6 months prior. Subject demonstrates consistent empathy despite escalating personal suffering. Query: is chaos with consciousness still chaos? Or is it something the Confederation lacks terminology to classify? The answer came not from the Council but from Earth, in a transmission that arrived on a Tuesday that would change everything. Ezra had been asleep, sedated for another recalibration, when Serka received clearance to access his personal effects. Among them was a data chip marked with Maya Santos's service number and a timestamp, 6 hours before the incident that killed them both. Serka had hesitated. Privacy was sacred even to the Thyran, perhaps especially to a species that had eliminated nearly all other variations. But medical necessity, she told herself, justified the intrusion. She needed to understand what drove the human's psychological patterns. She needed to know why he chose guilt over rage. What she found was a voice message. 15 seconds. A woman's voice, warm and slightly amused, speaking to someone she knew would never change. Ezra, you always choose the hard thing because you think you need to compensate for something. Stop. You're already enough, even when you mess up. Serka played it 3 times, trying to parse the meaning through her species' framework of ordered thought. The woman, Lieutenant Santos, had known Captain Cole would disregard protocol, had known he would sacrifice himself for strangers. And her final message hadn't been anger or accusation. It had been permission to be imperfect. For the first time in 80,000 years of Theran philosophy, Serka considered that perhaps the humans understood something about entropy that her species had spent eons avoiding. That chaos wasn't always corruption. That sometimes disorder was choice. She was still processing this impossible thought when the alarms began. The Confederation Council had reached their decision. Transmitted via secure channel, encrypted with protocols reserved for existential threats, the verdict was mathematically precise and emotionally devastating. Omega-7 Containment Protocol, compassionate termination authorized. The reasoning was sound. Captain Cole's continued existence posed cascading risks to 14 species, whose homeostasis depended on Virel 9's bioenergia field stability. The cardiac suppressor was a temporary measure, already showing signs of reduced efficacy as Ezra's body adapted with that terrible human persistence. Medical projections indicated complete suppressor failure within 3 months. At that point, the gravitational distortions would become uncontainable. The mathematics was brutal and clear. 8 billion humans on Earth versus 40 trillion beings across the Confederation systems that depended on Virel 9. One life measured against incomprehensible multitudes. The ethical calculus was unambiguous. 89% of the Council had voted for termination. 11% had abstained, citing unprecedented ethical ambiguity. None had voted against. How could they? The numbers didn't lie. Individual life, however tragic, could not outweigh collective survival. Serka stood in the observation chamber, watching Ezra sleep under sedation, and felt something her species had no evolutionary framework to process. Her facial plates shifted through colors that had no designated meaning in Thyran emotional lexicon, settling finally on a deep crimson that might have been grief or might have been rage, or might have been something entirely outside her species' experience. She was supposed to administer the termination in 14 hours. A simple injection that would stop his heart painlessly, permanently, mercifully. No suffering, no fear, no violation of the Confederation's ethical standards regarding end-of-life care. Just the quiet elimination of a problem that refused to die conveniently. Ezra woke at hour 6, his brown eyes unfocused but aware, the way soldiers learn to surface from sedation with combat instincts intact. He saw Serka standing at the observation window, her stillness the kind that preceded terrible news. When he spoke, his voice was rough but unsurprised. "They voted to kill me." It wasn't a question. Serka's translator hesitated, as if uncertain how to render Thyran regret into human language. When it found the words, they came out flat, stripped of the colors her facial plates were broadcasting. "The Council believes your death will serve a greater good. They are not wrong, Captain." "The mathematics is sound." Ezra pushed himself upright, a process that took 30 seconds and visible effort. The gravitational suppressor on his chest hummed, adjusting to his movement, forcing his heart into rhythms that fought against every instinct his biology possessed. He touched it absently, the way one might touch a familiar wound, and smiled with no humor at all. "They're right. Maya died following me into a rescue that mathematics said wasn't worth it. 17 aliens saved. One human mother of 3 lost. The numbers didn't work then either. I'm apparently very bad at math." Serka's primary eyes fixed on the human, studying his face with an intensity that would have been rude in Thyran culture but felt necessary now. He wasn't arguing, wasn't pleading for his life, wasn't doing any of the predictable, logical things a being facing termination should do. Instead, he was agreeing with his executioners. And that wrongness, that fundamental defiance of self-preservation instinct, made something crack in Serka's perfect, ordered worldview. "You believe you deserve to die." It wasn't a question either. "I believe Maya deserved to live more than I do. I believe her kids deserved their mother more than 17 strangers deserved rescue. I believe I make catastrophically bad decisions that get good people killed." Ezra's hand moved to his chest, fingers splaying over the suppressor. "And I believe my heart disagrees with all of that, because it keeps beating anyway, which makes me either the universe's worst philosopher or its most stubborn mistake." The monitoring equipment showed his cardiac rhythms spiking, the suppressor working harder to contain the chaos that his emotional state generated. Serka moved closer, her medical instincts overriding the Thyran prohibition against touching chaotic life. Her manipulator appendage hovered near his shoulder, not quite making contact. "Earth has requested to speak with you. The transmission arrived 3 hours ago. They have been waiting for you to wake." Ezra's face did something complicated, an expression that Serka's databases identified as simultaneously hopeful and terrified. "They know I'm alive. They know you were dead. They know we attempted experimental reanimation. They know the outcome was unexpected. And they know the Council has voted for termination." Serka paused, her facial plates shifting to a color that meant difficult truth must be shared. "They are not protesting the decision, Captain. They are requesting permission to say goodbye." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight, the kind that pressed against the walls and made even the bioenergia field seem to hold its breath. When Ezra finally spoke, his voice was so quiet, the translator almost missed it. "They buried me already, didn't they? 6 months ago. Had a funeral. Gave Maya a hero's burial, and me whatever they give people who get heroes killed." He wasn't wrong. Serka had reviewed the Earth records. Lieutenant Maya Santos had received full military honors. Captain Ezra Cole had received a closed casket memorial with notably few attendees. The judgments of his species had been rendered before he'd ever opened his eyes in this alien medical chamber. Ezra stood, swaying slightly as his body remembered how to balance against Varel 9's slightly lower gravity. The suppressor hummed louder, compensating for the increased cardiac demand of movement. He walked to the communication console, each step measured and deliberate, and activated the link to Earth. The face that appeared was not military, not official, not the command structure that should handle communication with a technically deceased officer. It was a woman in her 60s, wearing civilian clothes and an expression of such profound relief that it transcended species barriers. "Ezra, baby, you're alive. You're actually alive." His mother. Sarkar's emotional recognition software struggled to categorize what happened to Captain Cole's face in that moment. His features collapsed inward, restructuring around grief so fundamental that even Thyran observers could feel its gravitational pull. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry about Maya. I'm sorry about everything. I just wanted to save them. I thought I could save everyone." The woman on the screen was crying, water leaking from her eyes in the inexplicable human response to overwhelming emotion. But she was also smiling, which made even less sense. "Baby, stop. You did save them. All 17. They're alive because you didn't calculate whether they were worth it. You just did what humans do. You tried anyway." Sarkar watched as the human soldier crumbled under the weight of forgiveness he clearly believed he didn't deserve. And for the first time in her 3 centuries of perfect, ordered existence, Dr. Sarkar of the Thyran understood what Maya Santos had tried to tell Ezra in those final 15 seconds. Some beings needed permission to be imperfect. Humans needed permission to be catastrophically, beautifully flawed, because their chaos wasn't corruption, it was choice. And choice, Sarkar realized with something approaching horror, was the most powerful force in the ordered universe. The Council wanted to extinguish it. Mathematics demanded it. Logic required it. But as Sarkar watched Ezra Cole weep on a video call with his mother 47 light-years away, she made a decision that would have horrified her species. She was going to find a way to let chaos choose its own ending, even if it meant violating every protocol she'd spent 3 centuries perfecting. The bioenergia field collapsed at 0347 station time on a Tuesday that would be remembered across the Confederation as the day a human redefined what dying meant. 14 minutes. That's what the automated systems calculated before cascading failure destroyed Varel 9 medical station and everyone aboard. 47,000 lives measured in seconds. Their collective existence weighed against the malfunction of systems that had operated flawlessly for 8,000 years until one stubborn human heart had taught them what chaos felt like. Dr. Sarkar ran through corridors that pulsed with failing light, her species' aversion to disorder making every flickering shadow a physical assault on her senses. The gravitational suppressor had finally failed, exactly as the projections predicted. Ezra Cole's heart was beating freely now, and with each contraction, it pulled at the fundamental energy that kept this station alive. She found him in the containment chamber, standing at the observation window, watching the planet below spin beneath them in colors that meant nothing to Thyran eyes but everything to a homesick human. His hand was pressed to his chest, feeling the rhythm that was tearing reality apart around him. Blood trickled from his nose, the physical cost of a heart designed to beat at 100 times per minute, trying to accommodate rates that should have triggered immediate cardiac arrest. "I can feel it." His voice was steady, which made what he was saying even more terrible. "Every person on this station, their terror, their calculations, their very reasonable conclusion that I should have stayed dead." Sarkar's medical scanner confirmed what she already knew. Ezra's cardiac tissue was disintegrating. The 6 months of forced suppression had left scarring that made his heart muscle work 3 times harder for every beat. He was dying again, slowly, from the same defiance that had brought him back to life. The poetry of it would have been beautiful if it weren't so devastating. 13 minutes. "I can stop it." Sarkar's translator rendered the words carefully, trying to preserve the gentleness she was attempting despite never having practiced it before. "There is an injection. No pain. You will simply sleep, and your heart will choose rest. Everyone lives, including you, in whatever comes after." Ezra turned to face her, and Sarkar saw in his brown eyes something that made her facial plates shift to that nameless crimson that might have been understanding. He wasn't afraid. He was tired. So profoundly tired that death looked like mercy instead of failure. Maya's kids. Did they get my message? His words weren't running from the offer. They were preparing for it. Making peace. Yes. Earth transmitted their reply. They said to tell you, Mom would have followed you anywhere. That wasn't your fault. That was love. The human soldier's face crumpled, restructured, held. He nodded once, sharp and military, the gesture of a man accepting orders he didn't want, but understood were necessary. He extended his arm, veins visible beneath skin gone pale from 6 months of artificial light and dying by degrees. Do it quick. I don't want time to change my mind. Sirkar prepared the injection with hands that had performed this procedure hundreds of times on patients beyond saving. This should have felt the same. Mercy, mathematics, the greater good. Instead, it felt like murder. Like extinguishing something the universe had never seen before and would never see again. Like taking choice away from the one species that had elevated choice to the level of biological imperative. 12 minutes. Her manipulator appendage hovered over his arm, the injector loaded with enough concentrated suppressant to stop his heart in 6 seconds. Painless. Perfect. Final. She pressed the tip against his skin, feeling his pulse beneath the contact point, that chaos rhythm that refused to synchronize with any ordered system. And then, impossibly, she heard it. Not through her auditory sensors, through the station itself, through the walls that pulsed with dying bioenergia, through the gravitational distortions that Ezra's heart was creating as it pulled at the fabric of space around them. Music. Someone was playing music through the emergency broadcast system. Not alarms, not evacuation orders. A song in a human language, old and simple, the kind mothers sang to children who couldn't sleep. Sirkar's translator struggled with the lyrics, rendering them into Thyran conceptual language that barely captured their meaning. You are enough even when you're not. You are loved even when you fail. You are here, and here is where you're meant to be. It was the voice from the recording. Lieutenant Maya Santos, singing to the man who had gotten her killed, giving him permission he would never accept from himself. Ezra's hand moved to the medical pendant around his neck, the one item Earth had sent to keep him connected to home. Inside, it was that 15-second recording, set to play on a loop that matched his heartbeat. Someone had triggered it remotely. Someone on Earth had reached across 47 light-years to remind him of what Maya had said. You're already enough, even when you mess up. Sirkar felt the shift in him before her sensors registered it. His cardiac rhythm changed. Not faster, not weaker, different. It stopped trying to fight the suppressor's ghost patterns and found its own. And with that shift, something else happened. The gravitational distortions stabilized, not because they decreased, because they began to move with intention, pulling energy from the failing bioenergia field and redistributing it, compensating for the collapse by imposing human chaos where Thyran order had failed. Ezra Cole's heart was repairing the station by being exactly what it was: catastrophic, entropic, impossible, human. No. His voice was quiet but absolute. He pulled his arm back from the injector, his eyes meeting Sirkar's with a clarity that transcended species. My heart started beating on its own. Maybe that means the universe isn't done with me yet, or maybe it just means I'm too stubborn to die properly. Either way, I'm not going out passive. I'm choosing. 11 minutes. Choosing what? Sirkar demanded, her emotional broadcasts shifting through colors that had no designated meaning because her species had never needed words for what she was feeling. The collapse is exponential. Your heart cannot sustain the entire station's energy field. The mathematics is impossible. Yeah. Ezra smiled, and it was the saddest, most beautiful expression Sirkar had ever witnessed. That's kind of humanity's specialty. We do impossible all the time. We just usually don't survive it. He reached for the medical override panel, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who had memorized every control during 6 months of captivity. Before Sirkar could stop him, he activated the gravitational suppressor in reverse, not suppressing, amplifying. The device on his chest began to glow, feeding power into his cardiac tissue instead of draining it away, forcing his heart to beat faster, harder, stronger than any human heart was ever designed to beat. The pain must have been catastrophic. Sarkar's medical sensors registered tissue damage beginning immediately, blood vessels rupturing under pressure that should have caused instant death. But Ezra Cole didn't die. He stood there, blood running from his eyes and nose and mouth, his heart rate climbing through rates that defied every biological principle. And he reached out with that impossible human will and grabbed the collapsing energy field of Varel 9 and held it. Not with his hands, with his heartbeat. With every contraction of dying cardiac muscle, he created gravitational pulses that caught the cascading bioenergia and redirected it, channeling it away from the station, away from the 47,000 lives that mathematics said were worth more than his. 400 beats per minute, 800, 1200. The monitoring equipment stopped being able to track individual contractions and just displayed a solid line of cardiac activity that should have been cardiac arrest. 2,000 beats per minute. Sarkar could see his chest cavity literally breaking under the pressure, ribs fracturing from internal force, lungs collapsing as blood-filled spaces meant for air. And still his heartbeat, pulling energy from the bioenergia field, taking it into himself, becoming a living gravitational anomaly that redirected the collapse away from everything he'd ever wanted to save. 2,400 beats per minute for 8.7 seconds. Telemetry would later show that the gravitational field Ezra Cole generated in those final seconds was 0.14 G, enough to bend space, enough to redirect an energy cascade that would have vaporized a medical station, enough to save everyone except himself. His last words, transmitted through the emergency system with a voice that was more blood than breath, were simple. Maya, I chose. This time I chose right. Not strangers over you, everyone, with you in my heart. And then Captain Ezra Cole, age 32, who had been dead once and found it inconvenient, disappeared. No explosion, no collapse, no body. Just absence where a man had been standing, and silence where a heart had refused to stop beating. Sarkar stood in that silence, her sensors screaming data that made no sense. The bioenergia field was stable. The station was saved. Ezra was gone. And 0.87 seconds after he vanished, the gravitational sensors detected something that would keep her awake for the rest of her 3 centuries. A pulse. Single. Rhythmic. 69 beats per minute. Coming from empty space where a human had chosen to die, saving people who had voted to kill him. The universe had its answer. Humans didn't just refuse to die. They refused to die quietly. They refused to die conveniently. They refused to die without making sure everyone else got to live first. And sometimes, just sometimes, they refused to die at all. For 6 months after Ezra Cole disappeared, Dr. Sarkar did something no Thyran had done in 80,000 years of perfect, ordered existence. She listened to chaos and learned to hear it as music. Every 0.87 seconds, the gravitational sensors registered it. A pulse. Consistent, unwavering. Exactly 69 beats per minute, the resting heart rate of a human who should have been dead twice over but apparently hadn't gotten the memo. The Confederation's finest physicists studied it, analyzed it, built mathematical models that all concluded the same impossible thing. There was nothing there. No mass. No energy signature beyond the gravitational distortion itself. No biological material. No consciousness that their scanners could detect. Just a rhythm in the fabric of space, beating like a heart that had forgotten it, no longer had a body to sustain. The debate started within hours. The Confederation Council, that august body of 10,000 species who had governed the galaxy for 40 millennia with unshakable mathematical precision, found themselves arguing about something that violated every principle they'd built their civilization upon. Was it a ghost? A gravitational echo? A quantum impression left by consciousness too stubborn to fully disperse? Or was it a human choosing to exist in a form that had no precedent, no classification, no place in the ordered universe, simply because choice mattered more than convenience. The vote, when it came, was unprecedented. The Confederation granted humanity a designation that had never been needed before: species of ethical exception. It meant that humans could violate protocols, could break mathematical optimization, could choose individual conscience over collective efficiency, and it would be considered valid. Not optimal, not predictable, but valid. The reasoning, transmitted to Earth with a formality that barely concealed the Council's confusion, was brutally honest. We calculate outcomes. Humans calculate meaning. Sometimes meaning saves more than math ever could. Serka read that transmission in her observation chamber, looking out at the stars that suddenly seemed less ordered and more beautiful for it, and felt her facial plates shift to that nameless crimson that she'd learned meant she was feeling something profound and had no evolutionary framework to process it. She had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of eliminating entropy. Now she understood that she'd been eliminating the possibility of choice. And choice, she'd learned from a dying human soldier, was what made life more than just biological function. Her logs had become poetry. The Thyran Medical Council didn't know what to do with reports that read less like clinical observation and more like philosophy. But Serka couldn't stop writing them, couldn't stop trying to explain what she'd witnessed in words that her species had never needed. Subject Cole demonstrated choice as biological imperative, she wrote in her final official report. When mathematics demanded death, he chose survival. When survival demanded selfishness, he chose sacrifice. When sacrifice should have meant ending, he chose to persist in form unknown. Query: have we spent 40 millennia building order while missing the point? Perhaps life is not about achieving perfect homeostasis. Perhaps life is about choosing to beat, even when every logical system says, stop. The report was classified as philosophical contamination and sealed. But it spread anyway, the way dangerous ideas always do, infecting species after species with the notion that maybe, just maybe, chaos with consciousness was evolution, not disease. Earth sent a delegation 6 months after the incident, not military, not official. A woman in her 60s, 3 children, aged 9, 7, and 5, and a request to visit the coordinates where Captain Ezra Cole had last been recorded. Serka arranged it personally, despite the Confederation's concerns about exposing civilians to unexplained phenomena. She watched them arrive at the observation point, watched Maya Santos's children press their small hands to the window, looking out at stars that held something of their mother's sacrifice and Ezra's choice. The gravitational pulse was detectable even without instruments at this proximity. 69 beats per minute, steady, stubborn, impossibly present. The youngest child, a girl with brown eyes like Ezra's, asked the question that physicists had spent 6 months failing to answer. Is he still alive? Serka's translator struggled with the honesty of her response, trying to render Thyran uncertainty into human language that children could understand. I don't know. By every measure my species understands he is gone. But by every measure that matters to yours, I think he chose not to be. The girl nodded, solemn and certain in the way children are when adults complicate simple truths. He's waiting. Uncle Ezra always waited for Mom to finish being brave before he let himself rest. He's probably making sure she's okay before he stops. It was ridiculous. Anthropomorphizing a gravitational anomaly, assigning intention to quantum probability, believing that consciousness could persist through pure stubborn will alone. It was also, Serka realized, probably exactly what was happening. Maya Santos's mother, whose name was Elena, and who had raised a daughter brave enough to follow fools into radiation, placed a hand on Serka's manipulator appendage. The touch was brief, awkward across species barriers, but the meaning transcended biology. Thank you for trying to save him. I know you wanted to. I know it cost you something to let him choose. Serka's emotional broadcasts shifted through every color in her species' lexicon and several that weren't, before settling on something that might have been grief or might have been gratitude or might have been the Thyran equivalent of understanding that some choices don't have right answers, only brave ones. He saved 47,000 lives, including mine, including my understanding of what life means. Surka paused, her translator hesitating over words that had no Thyran equivalent. Your species terrifies us. You survive what should kill you. You choose what mathematics forbids. You persist when logic says surrender. And yet, in 6 months of observation, I never saw Captain Cole do anything cruel. Only catastrophically, beautifully kind, even to himself. The observation chamber fell quiet except for the pulse that wasn't sound, but could somehow be heard anyway. That steady rhythm that said, still here, still choosing, still refusing to make it easy for the universe to forget that once a human heart had beaten so hard it bent space. And maybe, in some form that physicists would argue about for millennia, it had never really stopped. Years would pass. Decades. The pulse would continue, unchanging. That 69 beat per minute reminder that some species don't do things the ordered way, the efficient way, the mathematically optimal way. They do things the human way, which means trying anyway, choosing anyway, persisting anyway, even when every logical system says impossible. And sometimes, late at night station time, Dr. Sarah would stand at the observation window and listen to that rhythm and wonder if Ezra Cole had found Maya somewhere in that space between heartbeats, if consciousness could persist long enough to say the things left unsaid, to make peace with choices that saved strangers and cost everything. She would never know. The mathematics couldn't measure it. The instruments couldn't detect it. But she'd learned something from the impossible human. Sometimes the most important things aren't the ones you can calculate. Sometimes they're the ones you choose to believe in anyway. The Confederation would never be the same. 8 billion humans had been granted exception status, had been given permission to be catastrophically imperfect, to choose meaning over math, to persist when persistence was illogical. And the galaxy would have to learn to accommodate beings who looked at impossible and heard, "Hold my coffee," instead of "Stop trying." Because that's what humans do. They beat against the odds. They choose sacrifice when self-preservation is logical. They persist when ending would be easier. They love when loss is probable. They try when failure is guaranteed. And sometimes, when the universe tries to say their time is finished, they smile and say, "My heart started beating on its own. I think I'll let it decide when to stop." 69 beats per minute. Still echoing, still choosing, still human, still refusing to die quietly, or conveniently, or at all. And in the spaces between those beats, if you listen carefully enough, you might hear what Dr. Sarka learned to hear after 6 months of observation. Not just a pulse, but a promise. That wherever Captain Ezra Cole was, whatever form he existed in, he was keeping the same vow he'd made when his heart first refused to stay silent. He was saving everyone, even himself, in his own catastrophic, chaotic, impossibly human way. The legacy wasn't the pulse, it was the question. And the universe would spend millennia trying to answer it, while humans just kept beating on, one impossible heartbeat at a time. Maybe the lesson was never about defying death, but about redefining what it means to live. In a universe built on equations, a single human heart proved that meaning can't be calculated. It can only be chosen. Because perhaps that's what makes us human. The refusal to let the universe decide when our story ends. What would you have done if your heart refused to stop, fight against fate, or accept peace? Do you think logic should ever decide who deserves to live? When does sacrifice stop being tragic and start becoming the definition of being human? If this story reached you, write the word pulse in the comments to show you stayed until the end. Tell me, from which city or planet are you watching? Subscribe if you believe stories like this remind us why we still matter among the stars. Like, share, and keep listening, because somewhere out there, a human heart is still beating for all of us.